Madai, Thoughts of Antiquity on a Chu River. Cold dew settles in evening light. The faint sun sets behind Chu hills. In trees by the lake, apes cry. I drift in my orchid boat. A bright moon rises over broad marshland. Streams rush in dark valleys. The Lord in the clouds does not appear. All night I am alone in autumn sadness. Okay, so here we have the second and last of the poems by Madai, which are included in this anthology. Now, the title of the poem is very interesting. Thoughts of Antiquity on a Chu River, and it introduces us two main aspects of the poem. The first is its geographical location. So the poem is taking place near a Chu River. Remember, Chu, we've talked about this previously, is a region, a traditional, an ancient region and a kingdom in China, basically situated in the middle to lower course of the Yangtze Valley. So in the most ancient Chinese history, it would have been a southern borderland, a semi-barbaric civilization and culture, not completely assimilated to the cultural habits and beliefs of the Yellow River Valley populations. It had specific characteristics too, like its own subclimate, much warmer and wetter than the northern one. It was a better place for rice cultivation, much more humid. Citrus fruits flourished there, and it had its own peculiar culture with a lot of shamanistic elements, of which we will talk about in a minute when we explain some of the images that appear in the poem. So the poem is taking place in an area of Chu. Madai is there, probably in exile or doing some duties in an official capacity. And the poem is also titled Thoughts of Antiquity here. Now, Thoughts of Antiquity, I imagine you could name it a subgenre of Chinese poetry, that is, thinking about the past, reminiscing the past. Now, Chinese civilization as such classical Chinese civilization had a very strong historical conscience, and history writing and historical texts were very central, very important to traditional Chinese culture, much more so than they were to Western culture. I mean, the status, the prestige of historians in ancient China, people like Sima Qian or the compilers of the dynastic histories, were, infinitely higher than those of historians in Greece and Rome, who generally did not have much prestige or even official institutional postings and capacities. Now, generally, most scholar officials like to dwell in the past and to write about the past, but thinking about antiquity and writing poems about reminiscing antiquity are seldom neutral in the Chinese scholar official tradition. Well, one of the conventions of classical Chinese poetry is indirect criticism. Already from Confucius and even before that, there is this idea that one of the main uses, if not the main use of poetry, is for political criticism. It is to be used by the people and the ministers to remonstrance against the rulers, and it's a particularly favored medium for remonstrance because it's indirect. So it's not directly offensive to the ruler. It hides itself under the aesthetic trappings of an art form, which gives it greater leeway for criticizing politics. So poems about the past were generally not just reminiscences of a glorious past or past events. They were generally to be read as implicit criticism of the present, where a past example that was supposed to be similar to the present was shown off in juxtaposition or in displacement of the current predicaments of the individual or the state, which the poet couldn't address directly. We've already encountered poems like this. I remember one about a tower in North China by Chen Tzuang, in which there's this contrast between the ruins of a tower and therefore the situation in the present. And that was a tower in which scholar officials had been treated well by a king in the remote past. The present ruin of the tower evokes the current situation in the empire where sage advisors are not recognized. So this poem that we have today, its main theme really is a remonstrance. It's a criticism of the present disguised through an evocation of the past, of the images of antiquity or of the past that appear seem to be from the references in the poem to Orchard Boat, Lord in the Clouds, to the poetry of the Chuzhu. We've already talked previously about this anthology. This was a late Warring States Han Dynasty anthology of poems created in the south of China. The main figure in the collection being Chu Yuan, a mythical scholar official who was ignored by his sovereign and who wrote poems of complaint at his isolation and at the corruption of his times. These poems include a lot of shamanistic imagery. They're poems in which the poet makes flights of fancy, travels through the heavens in chariots pulled by dragons, gets to meet with gods and goddesses. And all this tends to be pretty symbolic of the poet's desire to meet the sovereign and to advise him and to get the sovereign to listen to him. And they use a lot of flower imagery from the south, where the flowers that the poet decks himself with are, they're used for seducing and bringing the deity to possess the shaman poet or to make an act of appearance, but they also act symbolically as metaphors for the virtue of the poet. So Ma Dai is here evoking Chu Yuan and evoking this type of poetry. And so he's indirectly stating that he is like Chu Yuan. He is a virtuous official who is being ignored or slandered and kept away from the sovereign. So that would be, as I said, the main topic of the poem. In fact, a note to this poem in this edition explains that Ma Dai had been exiled to a low post in southern China because of his plain-spoken criticism of government policy. Another topic, a secondary topic in the poem, but quite explicit, apart from the description of the stereotypical landscape of southern China, is the autumnal background, which, as in many poems we've encountered before, acts as an intensifier of the sad, melancholy, pessimistic ideas and tone of the poem. Remember, autumn is the saddest season, the most melancholy season of the year. Not necessarily the saddest, winter is worse, but autumn is bittersweet and melancholy. Okay then, so let's, as usual, comment the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. Cold dew settles in evening light. The faint sun sets behind Chu hills. So the poem starts with two melancholy, sad images that also, without any other need of mentioning it, locate us chronologically, squarely into autumn. Cold dew settles in evening light. Dew, especially cold dew, is associated with autumn. It comes back after the summer, and it becomes one of the nature stereotypical images of autumn. So the cold dew is settling in evening light. Not only is it autumn, the end of the year, it's the end of the day, evening, the most melancholy part of the day. And the faint sun sets behind Chu hills. So a faint sun, not very strong sun, not giving very much light or heat, is hiding, is being snatched away behind the Chu hills. And again, we get the geographical location. Chu is a land of rivers, of water, but also quite mountainous. The surrounding area around the Yangtze River Valley and its middle course, has a pretty big number of mountains. Second couplet. So this is the more general, seasonal, and even you could say geographical and chronological background. Second couplet. In trees by the lake, apes cry. I drift in my orchard boat. So we're close to water, the title says, on a Chu river. Now nature gets a bit zoomed in and we get two images. One of them is visual and oral. You have trees next to the lake, Lake Tungting, the greatest lake in southern China. And in those trees by the lake, you hear the crying of apes, another typical, stereotypical autumn and southern China image. The sound that apes made at night was associated with crying, so a sad, melancholy sound. And the poet is drifting in an orchard boat. Why orchard boat? The south area of China, as we said, the area of Chu, was a marshy water, lots of rivers, lots of marshes, lots of orchards, aromatic orchards. But again, this image of flower, of orchard boats, and of the poet bedecked in flowers connects with the images of the Chuzhu anthology we talked about previously. And the poet is drifting. He's not stable. He's moving. Drifting is seldom a positive word or image in Chinese poetry. It connects with uprootedness and being away or out of one's place. A bright moon rises over broad marshland. Streams rush in dark valleys. We continue with some descriptive imagery of the area in which we're in, which also contains autumnal elements. So the bright moon is not exclusive of autumn, but autumn has a reputation for having the best moons of the year. So we have this bright moon rising, the sun sets, now the moon rises, over a broad marshland, a land of water. And streams rush in dark valleys. We can imagine now the moon has come out. We're at night now, no longer at evening. Valleys are dark because there is no light, or perhaps, they're surrounded by trees or whatever. Water is moving, rushing along. So we continue with the water imagery, which is very pervasive in the poem and in this couplet. Marshland and streams. Finally, the last couplet represents the failed theophany. So in a lot of the Chu-style poems of the Chuzhu, an epiphany is expected at the end of the poem, the appearance of the god that answers, the god or goddess that answers the call of the poet. So in shamanistic rituals, we might imagine, for example, the attempt at bringing the rain god by possession or invocation and dance by the shaman. The Lord in the clouds does not appear. So here, the god has not decided to appear. And Lord of the Clouds is probably one of the deities of the state of Chu that are referenced in the Chuzhu that appear in that anthology. But the Lord does not appear, so the poet is alone. All night I am alone in autumn sadness. So that concludes the poem. As I said, a literal reading of the poem is, would fit with just the sad, melancholy poet alone and sleepless at night in autumn and in the south type of poetry. But as I said, it's the title hinting at thoughts of antiquity, and some of the interpretations of this poem, including the one included in the notes to this edition, like to put the emphasis on its political interpretation. In light of a political interpretation, the female spirit of the dew mixing with the male sunlight in the first line would be evoking the emperor, the emperor being influenced too strongly by his ministers. The faint sun that appeared in, was it line 2? That would be a weak ruler, and the apes crying, the people suffering. So that could also make sense, and really puts on the forefront this strong allegorical element that a lot of classical Chinese poetry has, especially the poetry by scholar officials, which has intentions behind it.